All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Charles Margulis. I'm with the Center for Environmental Health. We're a national nonprofit. We work to protect children and families from harmful chemicals in your food, air, water, and in consumer products. And today we're going to be mostly talking about food, and in particular genetically engineered food, also known as GMOs, and the threat to biodiversity. So to get into the topic, I thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about human diversity first off. And this is from a recent poll on human diversity. And I just want you to take a look at this and think about whether you agree or disagree with the statement. There's no right answer. It's just something you can take a look at and think about. The ideal society is colorblind and treats everyone the same, regardless of race. So that's one way to think about human diversity. Think about if you agree or disagree with that. And another question on human diversity, again, no right answer. Embracing diversity and celebrating our differences would improve society. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? So again, as I mentioned, these are from a recent poll, and think about if you agree or disagree with that statement. And I'll show you what came up in this result. This was a poll of mostly young Americans. And interestingly, 75% said they agreed with the first statement, that the ideal society is colorblind and treats everyone equally regardless of race. And about 75% also agreed with the second statement, that embracing diversity and celebrating differences would improve society. So remember that as we talk about agricultural biodiversity. I'm going to pose two statements about agricultural biodiversity and think if you agree or disagree with these statements. The first is large-scale modern farming is necessary to produce the food needed for the growing world population. So think about that and if you agree or disagree. And the next statement on agricultural biodiversity is we need ecological farming to protect the environment and support rural families in feeding themselves. Think about if you agree or disagree with that statement. So today we're going to be talking about agricultural biodiversity in the context of genetic engineering. And I'll go back to the first poll before we get into GMOs, because I want you to look at the two statements together now. And you'll find something interesting with the responses that Americans had, which is most Americans agree with both of these statements. And yet if you look closely at the two statements, you'll see they're actually contradictory. So if you have an ideal society that's colorblind, you can't also celebrate differences, right? Color blindness negates differences. You're saying we're not going to consider differences, we're just going to treat everyone equally. The second statement says, actually, we want to celebrate our differences and use them because diversity improves our society. So what this shows, I think, is Americans are confused about diversity when it comes to race and class and issues like that. You can't have two contradictory uh, thoughts in your head and think they're both true. That doesn't make sense. What I'm going to pose today is that if you look at agricultural biodiversity, we'll find a similar confusion in a lot of people. And I think that's because of the way that the agribusiness industry, and particularly the GMO industry, talks about their products and why they're so important. So it's important to understand what we mean when we're talking about agricultural biodiversity and what has happened in the last 100 or so years of industrial agriculture, which is primarily that we've lost a lot of our agricultural biodiversity. So we've lost 90% of our crop varieties, 50% of our animal breeds. Today there are just very few plant and animal species that account for most of the food that we eat. And if you ask, well, why are we losing these species? Well, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the main reason for the loss of crop diversity is replacing local varieties, traditional seeds, with seeds that were created for industrial agriculture. So it's basically the spread of industrial agriculture has created a major loss in agricultural biodiversity. Now, why do we care about that? Well, biodiversity in agriculture is extremely important, in particular for harvesting the genetic material that we need to create new plant and animal varieties, especially when there's a problem in farming that needs to be resolved with new varieties. What plant breeders and animal breeders do is they go to those places where crops and animal species are most diverse, and they look for genetic traits that they can use to breed new varieties that will be hardier or that will be better adapted to whatever conditions they need. Agricultural biodiversity is also important as insurance. So it's insurance against, for example, pests that could devastate a crop. If farmers are planting a single type of a crop variety, pests can attack that entire crop, and a farmer could suffer major losses. Whereas if farmers are planting different kinds of varieties, what they usually find is that the pests attack some of the varieties but not others, and so they don't have a massive loss. They're able to have at least some of their crops survive that problem. Diversity is also important for human health and nutrition. So a diverse array of fruits and vegetables, diverse array of animal products are especially important for our nutritional needs. And farm diversity is also important for ecological diversity. So having a diverse farm systems are important to have diverse habitats around the farm as well. So farm systems that are diverse tend to nurture diversity around the farm. And finally, agricultural diversity is important in the context of human diversity because many local traditions, local cultures, and cultures around the world rely on their native crops as part of their ecosystem. So their culture, their traditions, their habits are all attuned with their native varieties. And losses of those varieties can mean losses of their culture in a similar way where language, loss of a language can be a loss of culture. Well, loss of food varieties and crop varieties can also lead to a loss of culture. So agricultural biodiversity is extremely important. That's an important thing to keep in mind as we talk about GMOs today. So when you talk about GMO foods, it's important to look at, well, what are out there. And as you see, about 80% of the packaged foods in our supermarkets have some ingredients from GMOs, but really just from 4 crops. So you'll see 5 crops are on here. One of them is cotton, which is not a major food crop. Obviously, cotton is more of a fiber crop. So it's really 4 food crops: soy, canola, corn, and sugar beets that make up most of the GMO ingredients in our processed foods. And when I started working on GMOs around 20 years ago, we had 3 of these 4 GMO foods. Sugar beets are the only one that's relatively recent, in about the past 5 years. But all of these other GMO foods are the same ones that we've had for the past 20 years. And what's interesting is the biotech industry 20 years ago said, in 5 years, all of our food will be GMO. Well, that's simply not the case. In fact, they have just one additional major crop in the past 20 years. So you'll hear people say often, I go to the grocery store and everything I buy is GMO. I can't avoid it. How can I avoid eating GMO food? And in this picture, you'll see almost everything in this picture is food from GMOs. You'll see canned soups, packaged chips, breakfast cereal, salad dressings, cookies, on and on. If you go and look in the packaged foods in your supermarket, you're going to find GMO ingredients. And that's because just 2 crops, corn and soybeans, end up in about 80% of our packaged foods. And if you look in the labels, you'll see corn oil, soy lecithin, corn starch. You'll even see many ingredients like maltodextrin or lecithin, where you might not know it by looking at it, but those are also derived from corn and soybeans. So when it comes to packaged foods, it is difficult to avoid GMOs. The flip side of that is that fresh fruits and vegetables, meats and seafoods are non-GMO. For the most part, there are no GMO meats and seafoods on the market yet. We'll talk a little bit later about seafood, but at this point there are no GMO meats and seafoods on the market. There are no nuts, grains, seeds, pastas, beans, rice. All of that is non-GMO. Uh, Vegetables are non-GMO. So the fresh fruits and vegetables in your grocery stores are non-GMO. Fresh fruits, with one possible exception. Some of the papaya from Hawaii is GMO, but other than that, fresh fruits are all non-GMO. And more, there's more packaged food that is now non-GMO. And you'll start seeing in many supermarkets, especially natural food stores, but even mainstream supermarkets now have more and more packaged foods that are certified non-GMO. And you can even see a label that shows that they've been certified non-GMO. So when people say, oh, I can't eat non-GMO, well, it's actually pretty easy to eat non-GMO, especially if you're eating a lot of fresh foods, whole foods, doing a lot of your own cooking instead of relying on packaged foods. It's actually not that difficult to eat non-GMO foods. So what are GMOs? Why do we have them, and why do people want them? Well, there are basically two types of GMOs that are being developed and marketed today. And again, these are the same two types that have been around for the past 20 years. There have been no major new developments in the past 20 years. So the two types are what are called herbicide-tolerant crops and insect-resistant crops. And then some crops have both herbicide tolerance and insect resistance. These are the two types of genetic engineering that are around today. The insect-resistant crops contain a pesticide in the crop. So GMO corn that is insect resistant is the most common variety. And what happens in this GMO corn is that genetic engineers have found a way to create the corn so that while it is growing, it is producing a pesticide in every part of the plant. So it's in the leaves, it's in the stalks, and it's in the edible part of corn that you'll be eating. So now, instead of farmers spraying the pesticide on the crop, that pesticide is actually in the crop. So when you're eating it, there's no way to get rid of it. You can't wash it off. When you're eating GMO corn, you're eating a pesticide. Luckily, the flip side of it is that most corn goes for animal feed, so it's animals, unfortunately, that are eating these pesticide-injected crops. The other major kind of GMO crop are herbicide-tolerant crops. You may have heard of Roundup Ready crops, and that's the most common kind of herbicide-tolerant crop that's sold worldwide. In the United States, about 70 to 80% of all GMOs are herbicide-tolerant crops, and most of those are Roundup Ready crops. So what does that mean? What is an herbicide-tolerant crop, and why would anybody want it? Well, before you had these kinds of crops, you couldn't spray an herbicide like Roundup on your crops. Roundup is what's called a broad-spectrum herbicide. It kills pretty much anything green that's growing. Farmers like chemicals like Roundup because before their crops come up, they can spray their fields and do what's called a pre-emergence treatment to kill any weeds that might be coming up before the crop is planted. If farmers wanted to use a pesticide like Roundup, an herbicide like Roundup, so herbicides are weed-killing plants. If they wanted to kill weeds with Roundup before there were GMOs, well, they had to be very careful. They had to spray between the crops to make sure that they didn't kill their crop as well. What happens with the herbicide-tolerant soybeans or corn is that now the farmers can spray the crop directly. So they don't have to worry about being very careful and just using a little bit of the herbicide. They can use a whole blast of it, what they call is over the top. And as you can see in this picture, the worker is just spraying right on top of the crop. What happens is the crop is resistant to the herbicide or tolerant to the herbicide. The herbicide doesn't kill the crop, but it will kill the nearby weeds. And so farmers like that because it's a lot easier to spray. You don't have to be very targeted. You don't have to be very careful. You can just go through the field and do a big broad spectrum spraying of the herbicide. And if the weeds come back, well, you can do it a second time. If the weeds come back again, you can do it a third time. And what's happening is farmers are spraying more and more Roundup on their crops. That's a good deal for the GMO companies because Monsanto, the maker of Roundup Ready crops, also makes Roundup. And so they get double the profits because now they sell farmers the seed, the Roundup Ready seed, the GMO seed, and they also sell farmers the chemical that goes with it. And they tell the farmers, This is a great deal because now you don't have to worry about using all these other herbicides. Just spray Roundup. You can spray it once, you can spray it twice, you can spray it 3 times. And that's great for Monsanto because it keeps the farmers coming back. The promises that the GMO companies made to farmers is that you'll be using fewer pesticides, you'll be using safer pesticides, and you'll produce the food that we need to feed the world with GMOs. The idea that we're going to be using fewer pesticides, well, as I just described, before Roundup Ready crops, the most widely sold GMO crops in the world, before we had those crops, farmers had to be very careful about spraying pesticides. Now they can spray them over the top as much as they want, 3 times a season. That doesn't sound like a way to use fewer pesticides, and in fact it isn't. According to USDA data, in the first 16 years of GMO crops, there's been more than 400 million pounds more pesticides used because of GMO crops than previous to the advent of GMO crops. So there's absolutely no doubt that the use of pesticides is increasing because of GMO crops. Secondly, the idea that we're going to be using safer pesticides isn't true either. Monsanto said, well, we'll use Roundup in place of all these older, more toxic herbicides. Well, in fact, what's been happening is that weeds are now resistant to Roundup. If you spray the same herbicide on a field year after year, time after time, every time it's going to be used for weed control, what happens is the only weeds that survive are weeds that have a genetic resistance to that herbicide. And those weeds proliferate over season after season, and they grow season after season. And soon farmers have a field that's full of weeds that no longer are controlled by Roundup. So what do they have to do? Well, they have to go back to using the older, more toxic herbicides. And in fact, Monsanto and others have encouraged farmers in their more recent publications to start using older, more toxic herbicides when Roundup doesn't work anymore. And this isn't just a small problem, but it's millions of acres of farmland across the entire American Midwest, and even out here in California, where there's not that much GMO growing, they're already seeing the spread of these resistant weeds that are no longer controlled by Roundup. And you'll see just on this page and on the next page, just some of the toxic herbicides. Many of them are carcinogen, known or possible carcinogens, that is known to cause cancer. Many of them are known to be known or suspected to be reproductive toxins that can lead to birth defects. Others cause water pollution. Others cause other kinds of impacts to farm animals, aquatic animals, nearby habitats. Not only has Monsanto and the GMO industry told farmers to use these older toxic pesticides, but they're also now developing new GMO crops that are resistant to these older toxic herbicides. So not only will farmers use these toxic chemicals with their Roundup Ready crops, but the GMO industry is now selling crops specifically intended to be used with older, more toxic herbicides. So this is just a great deal for the GMO companies because they are also pesticide companies, and that's important to understand. Monsanto, DuPont, Dow, those are the major companies that sell GMO crops, GMO seeds. They also are pesticide companies. They've been pesticide companies for the past 50 years. Now they like to talk about themselves as biotech companies, but they still sell pesticides. They still make money on the pesticides that they sell with their GMO crops. I saw a question that somebody wants to hear about GMO salmon, which we are going to get to in a little bit. So if you have questions about that, we'll be getting to that. Just hold on, and I'm happy to take more questions about that as we get to it later. Are GMOs going to produce the feed that we need to feed the growing world population? Well, the Union of Concerned Scientists did a study just a couple of years ago and found that GMO crops have no better crop yield than conventional crops. And in fact, traditional breeding experiments and new crops from traditional breeding have increased yields by 25% during a time period when GMOs did not have any crop increases at all. So if it was a problem of of not having enough food to feed the world, then GMOs would certainly not be the answer. But then we have to ask, is that really the problem? The United Nations found world hunger was around 820 million in 1995. That's about the time when GMO crops came into widespread use. Their United Nations goal at that time for this year was to cut world hunger in half. Unfortunately, they haven't made that great progress. We still have widespread hunger in the world with 795 million people in the world going hungry. So GMOs have been widely available for the past 20 years. Why hasn't hunger decreased if GMOs are the solution to world hunger? Why has there been such little change? And in fact, well, you might say, well, GMOs are grown mostly in the United States, and that's not where hunger is. Well, in fact, in 1995, we had about 35 million people going hungry in the United States. In 2015, we've increased that to about 48 million people going hungry in the United States. This is at the time when GMOs took off from 0 acres to to around 150 million acres or more in the United States. So again, we have all this GMO food available in the United States. Why are people still going hungry? And the answer is, world hunger experts will tell you that hunger is not primarily a problem of a lack of food. Hunger is a problem of wealth inequality and poverty. So if people are poor, they don't have enough money to buy food. And you see that even in the United States, not too far from Elgin High in northern Illinois in DeKalb County, which is the home of the DeKalb Seed Company, owned by Monsanto, one of the biggest GMO seed companies in the world. They make more GMO corn seed. They make GMO corn seed there. DeKalb is one of the biggest brands of Roundup Ready GMO corn seed, and yet they have 14% hunger in DeKalb County, with including 20% of all kids in DeKalb County go hungry. So hunger obviously is not a function of having a lack of food, but a function of wealth inequality and poverty. And in fact, world hunger experts will tell you GMOs are not necessary to feed the world, and in fact, organic and sustainable methods are more likely to be the approaches going forward that will feed the world. And I unfortunately don't have a slide about it because a study just came out this week on Wednesday from Washington State University, and I'll just read you the headline: 40 years of science, organic agriculture is key to feeding the world. And this was a study by Washington State University scientists who looked at 40 years of data from studies on organic agriculture and conventional agriculture, and find that the yields of organic agriculture, the profits for farmers, and protections for the environment and for farm workers show that organic agriculture is the best hope going forward for feeding the world's growing food needs. I want to talk a little bit about GMOs and the health risks because that's an important subject that people always ask about. Some of the risks include food allergies. When you introduce new genes into foods, unpredictable things can happen, including triggering allergic reactions that are unexpected. And this has already been shown in laboratory studies where GMOs were created, where the GMO companies hoped to bring a GMO to market, and only in the very last stages of laboratory analysis did they find that a new allergy was created with the GMO food. And it was just by chance that they found this out, because those kind of tests are not required in this country by the FDA or any other government agency. So GMOs could be triggering allergic reactions. Those foods could get onto the market, and we might not know it until it was too late, until people suffered from allergic responses. Similar with toxic reactions to food, or when you introduce a new gene, the food could create new food toxins. It could change the levels of toxins in the food, increase levels of natural toxins, or create new toxins that hadn't been in those foods before. And again, this has been found in a lab study in Australia where scientists were trying to create a new kind of pea, and they used genes from a legume. And they thought, well, peas and beans, they're very closely related. This will be no problem. And again, in the very late stages of development, they found that a toxic substance in the peas was dramatically increased and could cause severe food responses if people had eaten those foods. And again, those were tests that are not required to be done on GMO foods. And GMOs could also alter the nutritional levels of foods. So proteins, minerals, other nutrients in the foods could be altered, and you could come out with foods that have altered nutritional levels that make the foods less nutritious. Those are some of the health issues that people are concerned about when it comes to GMOs. People are also naturally concerned about GMO labeling. Since GMOs were introduced in the United States, they've been sold without labeling. And the United States is one of the few developed countries in the world where labels are not required on genetically engineered foods. So if you went to Europe, if you went to Japan, even Russia and China have requirements that GMO foods must be labeled. Here in the United States, we have no requirements for labeling GMO foods. If you compare that to something like car crash testing, you'll see it's very different. So if you want to put a new car model on the market, well, you have to do crash testing. The government requires you to meet safety standards, and they're very specific and they're very rigorous, and the government does independent testing. So the car companies do their testing, but the government also does their own independent testing. And they look at the cars and they test the cars independently, and they also label the cars. So if you want to buy a new car that is just now out on the market, well, you can look right on the sticker on the car window and see what happened in the crash testing, what's the crash test ratings. You can go on get more detailed information. If you contrast to GMOs, well, a GMO company could put a new GMO crop on the market with absolutely no safety testing. There's no requirements in the United States to have safety testing of GMO foods. All of the testing is voluntary, and it's all done by the companies that are putting the foods on the market. That's an obvious conflict of interest. If you want to make money off of these seeds, your interest is going to be to make the testing as simple and non-rigorous as possible so that the seeds pass whatever test you conduct. And again, the companies don't have to produce the test results for the government. They simply have to notify the government, yes, we've done these assessments, everything looks great to us, we're going to put it on the market, and by the way, we're not going to label it. This is obviously a problem. When you look at surveys of Americans over the past 20 years, there's been no change. Every survey done in the past 20 years shows the same two things. Anywhere from 70 to 90% of Americans say they want GMO foods to be labeled, and anywhere from 50 to 60 or 70% say if GMO foods were labeled, I'd probably avoid eating them. That's the basic reason why the biotech industry fights labeling so hard. They know that consumers would prefer to eat natural foods, non-GMO foods, foods that they know are safe and healthy and haven't been genetically manipulated. So back to biodiversity, and as we talked about before, it's important to remember the reasons that farm biodiversity is so important. And as you can see from this picture, a biodiverse farm has a certain look to it. So you'll see different crop varieties growing in close proximity. You'll even see trees that are integrated into the farm ecology. So tree crops grow right next to farm crops. And you see almost no barrier between the farm ecology and the native ecology. And that's not an accident. That's something that a biodiverse farm tries to do very intentionally, to work in harmony with nature as opposed to always trying to fight nature with a magic bullet solution. So industrial farm will look to GMOs or pesticides as the way to deal with farm problems, whereas a biodiverse farm looks at diversity as the solution to farm problems. So that's a way to look at the reason why we need diversity. One of the important reasons we need diverse farms is because of seeds that we need for breeding new varieties. As I mentioned before, the main reason why we've lost such farm diversity is the loss of traditional seeds. And saving seeds is an important tool of diverse farms in breeding new crops and breeding new varieties. Saving seeds is something that billions of farmers around the world do, not only to breed new varieties, but to have the food they need for planting for the next season, for their families and for their markets. In genetic engineering, for the first time in the history of agriculture, farmers don't own the seeds that they use to plant their crops. Farmers simply own the right to use that seed for one season. But farmers are barred from replanting that seed, from saving seeds and replanting that seeds for another year. Now, in the United States, that's not a huge problem, particularly in corn and soybeans. Most farmers buy new hybrid seeds every year anyway, although a lot of soybean farmers used to save seeds. But seed saving is pretty much gone in American farming. And with GMOs, farmers are legally barred from saving their seeds. And in fact, the GMO companies have sued hundreds of farmers who they suspected of saving seeds. Now, if you promote that kind of GMO agriculture around the world, well, what you're doing is taking away the food needs of 1.5 billion people, because there are 1.5 billion people around the world who rely on food from saved seeds for their daily nutrition. So when the GMO companies say, oh, we need GMOs to feed the world, well, it's actually the exact opposite. Because if they had their way, and if GMO seeds were widely sold around the world, 1.5 billion farmers who now replant their seeds every year would have no way to do that, and their families could be thrust into starvation because of GMOs. So seed saving is one of the most important things that you should think about when you think about biodiversity, GMOs, and why we need biodiverse ecological farms that are sustained by rural people, by diverse communities of rural people. Another important impact on diversity from GMOs is on monarch butterflies. In the United States, the Midwest of the United States, what's called the Corn Belt, has been a main feeding ground for monarch butterflies as they make their way on their annual migration from the United States down to Mexico and Central America. They go through the Corn Belt, and alongside cornfields grows a plant called milkweed, which is the main food source for monarch butterflies. Well, as I mentioned, with herbicide tolerant crops, with Roundup ready crops, farmers are now spraying over the top of their fields in broad applications, and what happens is that spray goes to the sides of the fields and along nearby the fields and kills the milkweed that's growing there as well. And scientists who track monarch butterflies say that the loss of the milkweed habitat in the Midwest is one of the main reasons for the decline of the monarch butterfly population. And there are other species as well that are affected by the decline of habitat, the plants that we've lost alongside and nearby farms that are now spraying herbicides widely on their GMO crops, whereas they used to spray much more carefully. You've also probably heard about bee colony collapse and the decline of bee species, and that's also tied to GMOs. When GMO crops came along, one of the major varieties, one of the insect-resistant varieties, was intended to kill a soil insect that was targeted with the insect-resistant varieties. But unfortunately, the GMO variety didn't work quite well enough on its own. So the GMO companies, being pesticide companies, came up with a pesticide that they could use in addition with the insect-resistant varieties. So before there were GMO crops, if you bought corn seed in this country, it was untreated seed. It was simply corn seed. Today, 90% or more of all the corn seed sold in the United States is treated with an insecticide. So the seed itself has an insecticide that's sprayed on it, and that insecticide grows with the plant along with the genetic engineered insecticide. Those insecticides are what are called neonicotinoids. You may have heard of these pesticides. They're similar to nicotine, the chemical found in cigarettes. Nicotine is a natural pesticide. Neonicotinoids are a synthetic version of nicotine that are created in pesticide laboratories and that are sprayed on corn seed. Unfortunately, now that they've been growing corn seed with these neonicotinoid pesticides for several years, many scientists believe that these are a main reason why bees are in such trouble, why there's this bee colony collapse, which is devastating bee populations, goes right back to these pesticides that are only on the corn because of GMO crops. So there's a direct relationship between the advent of GMO crops, the use of these pesticides, and the decline of bee populations. The biggest threat to diversity from industrial farming is simply the advent of industrial farming around the world. If you look at this industrial farm, it doesn't look diverse as the biodiverse farm that we looked at before. It's much more of what we call a monocrop farm, and that is simply a row after row after row of the same crop variety planted year after year, usually in rotation with one or two other monocrop varieties over hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of acres of farmland. What you get from industrial farming is farms that are not able to cope with natural pests, with natural weeds, with other natural farm problems in any way other than pesticides and GMOs, because they don't have any of the biodiverse solutions, the agricultural ecological solutions that diverse farms can use. And so they're basically stuck with using pesticides and GMOs. If we export industrial farming around the world with the use of GMO seeds, we're going to devastate agricultural biodiversity around the world. We're going to lose the diverse crop species that we need when the time comes to breed new varieties. And we're not going to have a hedge against, for example, climate change, which is causing farmers around the world to adapt needing new varieties. So GMOs are not essential for industrial farming. Industrial farming was around before GMOs were around, but GMOs today, farming was around before GMOs were around, but GMOs today promote industrial farming. The kinds of GMOs that are being developed by big agribusiness companies like Monsanto, DuPont, and Dow, they're intended to be sold for industrial farming. Those companies simply don't make the money that they want to make by selling to rural families around the world. They can only make money selling to giant industrial farms. So their intention is to promote industrial farming to be used with their GMO seeds. Somebody asked about GMO salmon, so I wanted to get into that a little bit. Salmon is the first food animal that's been approved for sale with genetic engineering. This is what's called a fast-growing aqua advantage salmon that a company in Canada has developed. They've been trying to get it approved for more than 10 years. The Food and Drug Administration just recently said they would approve the GMO salmon, although just a couple of weeks after they approved it, they said they would ban the import of the GMO salmon until they get the labeling issues worked out, and that may take another year or more. So it's not clear when, if ever, this GMO salmon would come to market. And in fact, most of the biggest retailers in the country, every company from Target to Whole Foods has said, labeled or not, they're not going to sell GMO salmon. So even if GMO salmon is approved, even if the labeling is in place, it's not clear if any retailer is going to sell the GMO salmon. Now, the argument for GMO salmon by the biotech industry is that, well, salmon are overfished, they're in trouble, therefore we need to do more aquaculture, what's called fish farming with salmon, and the best way to do that is with GMO salmon because they grow faster and they use less feed, and that's the best way to protect salmon for the future is with our fabulous GMO salmon. Oh, and by the way, we need these salmon to feed the growing world population, just what you've heard before about GMO crops. Well, if you look at that argument closely, you'll see it really doesn't make any sense. Um, I mean, basically, if you look at wild salmon and why are wild salmon at risk, one of the major reasons is because of the advent of fish farms. So fish farming results in the release of farmed fish into wild populations. And what happens when the farmed fish, which are not as robust as the wild fish, are released into the wild populations, and that happens by accident. So fish farms accidentally release eggs, they accidentally release full-grown growing fish, they accidentally release grown fish. This is not a small problem, it's a massive problem. In the last 20 years or so, there's been close to 1 million fish a year, 1 million salmon a year accidentally released into just the Atlantic fisheries, just the Atlantic salmon fisheries. So that's not a small problem. It's a problem that's very routine in salmon farming, is that fish are accidentally released. What happens when these farmed fish that are not robust are released? Well, they breed with the wild populations, and they compete with the wild populations. And both from competition and interbreeding, the wild population becomes at risk. Particularly interbreeding is a problem because the genetic pool of the wild population becomes more and more like a monocrop that you saw in agriculture, in farming and crop farming. Well, that happens in animal species too, where interbreeding from fish into wild populations dilutes the genetic pool until you have no more genetic diversity in the wild pool, but you have a genetic uniformity that's been bred from so many of these farm fish getting released and interbreeding with the wild stocks. And again, this isn't speculation. This has happened, for example, in Norway, where they invented salmon farming. Over the past 20 years, they've lost 80% or more of the genetic diversity of their wild salmon populations, and that's traced back to the loss of genetic diversity from escaped farmed fish. So if you look at the argument from the GMO salmon companies, well, that we need their farmed fish because wild fish are in trouble, well, what they're saying is we need farmed fish, which cause the problems with wild fish, to solve the problems with wild fish. So it's an argument that doesn't make any sense. If we wanted to really solve the problems with wild fish populations, we'd have less, not more, fish farming, and we'd really take steps to protect those wild salmon runs. And in fact, if you look at the market for salmon, since salmon farming has been in widespread use, the market for salmon has been flooded with farmed fish, but also the market for wild salmon has increased as well. So there's been much higher demand for salmon rather than helping the wild populations. It's actually led to increasing depletion of the wild populations. So if you really wanted to focus on fish that would help overfishing, first of all, you wouldn't focus on salmon because salmon are a relatively expensive fish to raise. It's a fish that needs other fish protein as opposed to many other farm fish which you can raise on plant-based diets. Salmon need fish meal to live. They can't be fed on grain. So you're focusing on a fish that requires fish protein for their diet. That fish protein could be going for people's protein needs if it wasn't going to fish farming. So you wouldn't look at salmon if you really wanted to feed the growing world populations and deal with overfishing problems. You'd look at other fish species and you'd look at other ways to actually promote genetic diversity in the wild, not with using fish farming, but with looking really at salmon runs and how you could promote the genetic diversity within the wild fish rather than this GMO engineering. Finally, I want to talk about animal cloning, which is technology related to GMOs. So cloning is a different technology, but it's related particularly in the sense that when animals are created with genetic engineering, the GMO industry would then need to use cloning to reproduce those animals, because you don't want to go to all the trouble of genetically engineering an animal and then just let it breed naturally. You want to clone it so you make sure you're recreating that animal in the exact same way with the exact same genes, so you recreate those genes that you wanted. In China, just at the end of last year, a company announced that they were creating a cloning factory, an animal cloning factory that would clone up to 1 million cows a year for the food market. Now, in the United States, as far as we know, we don't have any cloned food on the market, although a couple of years ago the FDA said they would approve cloned food if cloning companies wanted to put cloned food on the market. So cloning and GMOs are related, and it's important to stay attuned to what's going on with the cloning industry as well as the GMO industry, because both of those industries are working together to put food from clones and put food from GMO animals on our tables. I'll leave it there with a return to our question about agricultural biodiversity that I asked at the beginning. If you agree with the first question, large-scale modern farming is necessary to produce the food needed for a growing world population. Well, that question is basically saying that, GMO agriculture that's intensive and industrial, that's what we need to feed the growing world food population. If you agree with the second question, we need ecological farming that protects the environment, supports rural families in feeding themselves. Well, again, these are contradictory ways of looking at agriculture. So we can't have ecological farming with rural families in support of feeding themselves and GMO farming. There's only one of these two ways forward. I would say if we go the route of GMOs, we're going to devastate the food production that we need. We're going to devastate the biodiversity that we need for food population, especially in a world of climate change, where we're going to need new crop varieties, we're going to need new animal varieties. I would say the only way forward is with ecological farming that supports biodiversity and that supports traditional families around the world who have the traditional knowledge that we're going to need about their local crops, about their local animal varieties. When you look at the pharmaceutical industry, it's interesting because drug companies know when they go to the developing world and they talk to local people about their local crop varieties, they come out with new drugs because they find natural properties that they never would have found in the few crop varieties that we know from the United States. They go around the world looking for different kinds of crops and even animals, because that's where the genetic diversity is, where they can develop new drugs. Well, it's no different in agriculture, and as we go into the future, it's going to be more and more important. That diversity is going to be more and more important to sustain the food that we need for families around the world to feed themselves. So Bridget asks if there's discussion about labeling cloned animals. As I mentioned, the FDA looked at cloning and said they basically think that cloned animals are going to be okay for food production, and they did not say that they would require special labeling. So it's unlikely that there would be labeling if there is meat from cloned animals on the market. That's not to say that FDA couldn't change their mind on that once companies start to really bring food from clones on the market, but in the past 20 years, the FDA hasn't seemed willing to change their minds about GMO labeling, so it seems quite likely that there will not be labels on food from cloned animals in the market. Daniel asks, what are GMOs and why do we have them? Genetic engineering is a new food technology that's been developed just in the past 20 years, and it allows scientists to take genes from any species, from any animal, plant, microorganism, and insert it into food crops in ways that we never could before. So if breeders want to create a new food variety, well, they have to breed closely related crops or closely related animals. But with genetic engineering, you can take, for example, genes from a fish and insert them into a strawberry. And this isn't just a wild example. This is something that genetic engineers have actually done in lab experiments. They've taken genes from fish and inserted them into strawberries hoping to create a strawberry that would resist cold temperatures. So there are hundreds of examples like this where genetic engineers have tried to produce new food crops with genes from all kinds of animals, with all kinds of insects, with all kinds of microorganisms, hoping to bring them to our dinner tables. So that's what genetic engineering does. And why do we have genetic engineering? Well, the companies that make genetic engineering say that they want to bring more nutritious foods and healthier foods and different food varieties to the market. But the reality is they haven't done that. The reality is they've brought two different kinds of crops to the market. Those are the ones that I've talked about, the insect-resistant crops and the herbicide-tolerant crops. And both of those crops are intended to bring higher profits to the GMO companies. That's why they want to bring those crops to market. Other questions? So Daniel asked, if we have GMOs, why is starvation not cured? Yeah, and that's, as I mentioned before, the problem, there are two problems with suspecting that GMOs could be useful for resolving the problem of hunger. The first is that GMOs don't yield more than natural foods. Conventional crop breeding has done better in the past 20 years for producing more food than GMOs have done. So if we really wanted to produce more food as a way to reduce starvation, we would look at conventional breeding. We wouldn't look to GMOs. But the second reason is more important, and that is that experts in world hunger for the past 20 years have said have said that hunger is not primarily a problem of a lack of food. Hunger is a problem of inequality, of people not having enough money to buy food. And so, for example, I had a colleague from Brazil who would say, in Brazil we have a widespread starvation, we have widespread hunger, and if you go to the grocery stores, they're full of food. So why is that? Why is there still hunger in Brazil? Well, it's because there's wealth inequality. I mean, if you've heard anything from the presidential debates, you've been hearing a lot of talk about wealth inequality right here in the United States. As long as you have wealth inequality, you're going to have hunger. If you want to address hunger, address poverty and inequality. Somebody asked, what about rice that has vitamins like vitamin A in it? Yeah, you may have heard of this golden rice that the GMO companies developed. They say that this can help children around the world who need vitamin A in their diets because without vitamin A, childhood blindness is a major problem in many parts of the developing world. And that is true. Vitamin A deficiency has been a problem in the developing world for more than 50 years, where a lot of kids are born or suffer blindness because they don't have enough vitamin A in their diets. The GMO industry more than 15 years ago came out with this idea that they would simply engineer rice to have higher levels of vitamin A because in many parts of the world where there's vitamin A deficiency, people eat a lot of rice. And so they thought, well, we'll solve the vitamin A problem with rice that turns yellow because it has more vitamin A in it. The problem is they haven't been able to get it to work. They've had it on the they've had it in development for 15 years. Every 2 or 3 years they say we'll have it on the market in the next 2 years. 2 years goes by, they don't get it on the market, and then they say it'll be another 2 years. Just last week there was an article in, I believe it was Salon.com, that checked in again, and the researchers who are working on golden rice say, yeah, it's going to be another several years still. The problem, besides the problem that they're having getting it to work, is that once it does work, if it ever does work, the rice will be yellow, and eating yellow rice when everybody else is eating white rice is a stigma. So people will be stigmatized as poor if they eat this yellow rice. A lot of people aren't going to want to do that. Meanwhile, more than 20 years ago, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization said a simple supplementation pill twice a year could solve the vitamin A problem. So all you have to do is get a vitamin A pill to these areas twice a year, and that problem would be solved. So why hasn't the problem been solved? It's simply because we don't have the political will to solve it. It has nothing to do with needing a new technology. It has everything to do with the politics of people simply not wanting to put the resources in that's needed to solve that problem. It could be solved simply with the vitamin D supplementation. Somebody asked what's the percentage of daily food that consists of GMOs. Well, if you're eating a lot of packaged foods, you're probably eating about 80% of GMOs. On the other hand, my family and lots of families that I know eat fresh foods, fruits and vegetables, eat fresh foods. We eat very little packaged foods. So we're probably eating zero or very little GMOs. So it's hard to say what the average is. I suspect there are widespread differences if you looked at the spectrum of folks, from people who rely on packaged foods a lot to people who don't. If we ban GMOs, could farmers stay in business? Well, before 1995, there were plenty of farmers in business without GMOs. There are plenty of farmers around the world who grow food without GMOs. GMOs are not necessary for growing the food that we need. There's simply no evidence that GMOs increase yields, resist pests that can't be resisted in other ways. Organic corn and soybean farmers grow organic corn and soybeans with equal or greater yields than GMO farmers do, and they don't use GMOs and they don't use pesticides. So yeah, farmers could easily stay in business. We're not looking at is this farm or that farm going to survive without GMOs. What we're looking at is the next 50 years of our farming future, and what kind of farming systems do we want? Do we want industrial agriculture systems that devastate biodiversity, or do we want to turn away from that kind of a system and really put our resources into the kind of food that people want to eat? Because if you look at surveys over and over again, you see people say if organic food, food that was grown sustainably, if that was sold at the same price as conventional food that's sprayed with pesticides and made from GMOs, I would not eat the GMO foods, I would eat the organic food. Well, why are they not the same price? Well, it's because we put billions of dollars a year into the wrong kind of food. Our government spends 20 or 30 billion dollars a year supporting industrial agriculture. Now, those are direct subsidies to industrial agribusiness. We spend less than 1% of that on sustainable and organic farming. So why are we putting all of our resources into the kind of food that people don't want to eat? That's a backward system. What we need to do is turn that around completely, put those billions of dollars into the kind of food people want to eat, and turn our agriculture around, not just so we're getting the food that we want to eat, but that we're getting the kind of food that sustains the kind of biodiversity that we're going to need to sustain agriculture for the next 100 or 200 years. Because if we go the other route, we're going to come up with an agricultural crisis where one day we have nothing but monocrops that no longer grow because we've run out of magic bullet solutions. I think there was a question I missed. Oh, sorry. More about crops that have pesticides already in them. Well, I'll be real quick because I think I only have a minute. But yeah, this is the genetic engineering technology that took a natural soil bacteria, engineered the genes from that bacteria that produced a natural insecticide, and put it into the crop. So when the crop grows, it's producing that insecticide in every part of the plant. So GMO corn produces a bacteria called Bt in the crop. When insects chew on natural Bt bacteria, well, the natural bacteria kills certain insects. Now they chew on the crop, they get that bacteria, they die from chewing on the crop. What's different is that in the GMO variety, the bacteria is much more toxic more readily, and what scientists are concerned about is that that's going to lead to insects that are resistant. Farmers will no longer be able to use the natural Bt pesticide, which is known as one of the safest pesticides in the world. So those insect-resistant crops are very direct assault on one of the safest natural pesticides that farmers use. I think that's about all the time I have. Thanks you very much for joining me today. Enjoyed being with you, and look forward to doing it again next year.